McDonald's boss goes undercover as homeless, then fires entire staff on the spot after this happened. But before we get into this story, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And if you enjoy stories like these, make sure to subscribe, as we upload at the same time every day. The stench of stale grease hit Mark's nostrils the instant he stepped through the battered glass doors, and he nearly second-guessed his entire plan. The fluorescent lights inside flickered overhead, lending the space a sickly hue, while a trio of exhausted employees hustled behind the counter. One of them, wearing a manager's badge that read Chris, shot him a hard stare the moment he appeared. Mark tugged his worn hoodie lower over his forehead, reminding himself that he was here in disguise, undercover as a homeless man looking for work. To see exactly how this franchise was being run, he had to move fast. Something about the atmosphere felt off, and it wasn't just the sour odor clinging to the floor. Even the customers in line, a father wrangling two kids, and a couple of teens chatting loudly, seemed uneasy. It was as if everyone could sense tension brewing beneath the surface. Without preamble, Chris snarled, "We don't hand out free food here, man. If you're not buying, you need to leave." That was the first real flag, a blatant hostility that no self-respecting manager should show a prospective customer, or anyone for that matter. Mark forced a trembling half-smile, playing the part. He asked in a subdued tone if the place was hiring, swallowing back the impulse to snap at the manager. Chris leaned across the counter with a derisive laugh that carried all the way to the fryer station, where an older cook was dropping baskets of fries with trembling hands. "Hiring? You think we'd trust you to work here?" Chris's lip curled. "Find another spot to beg." Mark stayed quiet, letting the comment hang. He needed to observe, to get a genuine feel for how staff were treated, and he'd barely been here a minute before hostility bared its teeth. This was all he needed to know, that something rotten had taken root under the golden arches of this particular restaurant. He took a careful step sideways, glancing around for any employees who might contradict Chris's attitude. A petite young woman, with a name tag that read Maria, risked a glance in Mark's direction. Their eyes met for a moment, and the flicker of pity, or perhaps shame on her face, told him she didn't agree with how her manager was acting. But she looked away quickly, as though she'd learned the hard way that challenging Chris could cost her. The father with the two kids was trying to get someone's attention at the front counter, his voice growing louder as he asked to speak to a manager about an incorrect order. Chris waved him off dismissively, though, ignoring the complaint entirely. Mark inhaled slowly. He wasn't just some random interloper, and he sure wasn't a vagrant off the street. In reality, he was Mark Redford, a regional manager for McDonald's who decided to drop in for a surprise inspection, complete with a disguise to keep the staff from putting on their best behavior just for him. The corporate office had received whisperings of labor violations and staff mistreatment at this franchise, and rather than send an email or a mild warning, Mark had opted for direct, hands-on observation. He'd seen enough franchise owners put on a friendly face whenever regional managers visited. It was time for the unfiltered truth. The truth smacked him full force when he witnessed Chris, shoulders squared like a bully on a playground, stepping around the counter to confront a frail woman standing in line. She looked about as down on her luck as Mark was pretending to be, clothes threadbare, hair stringy. "I told you last time, you need money to be here," Chris sneered, oblivious to how a few of the other workers were quietly watching. A ripple of unease rippled through the room. Mark's fists clenched inside his hoodie's pockets, nails digging crescents into his palms. This was supposed to be a place that served the community, or at the very least, didn't treat people like garbage. The father with the kids finally raised his voice. "Hey, we got a wrong order, man. Can you just fix it?" Chris turned away from the struggling woman and barked over his shoulder. "If you want your damn order corrected, why don't you read the menu right next time?" A hush fell. Maria's eyes darted to Mark again, like she was silently warning him. "This is how it is around here. Don't get in the manager's crosshairs." Mark cleared his throat, deciding to risk a question. "Maybe I can talk to whoever's in charge. I really am looking for work." Chris folded his arms, glaring. "Yeah, well, whoever's in charge isn't here, buddy. You got the money for a meal?" Mark shook his head, continuing the role of a penniless drifter. Chris rolled his eyes, looking ready to throw Mark back out onto the street. "Then get lost." That was all the confirmation Mark needed. He'd planned to spend a day or two quietly observing, but Chris's behavior practically screamed mismanagement, if not outright cruelty. Still, Mark forced himself to back off. He needed more evidence. From inside his hoodie, he took in every detail: the customers leaving in frustration, the employees darting around like scared mice, the unaddressed complaints, the cook in the back swallowing back stress-induced tremors. It looked like nobody felt safe in this restaurant, and that was just the first few minutes of being here. Chris finally stomped off, leaving Mark near the entrance. When their paths crossed, Mark got a close-up whiff of stale cigarette smoke clinging to Chris's uniform. The manager muttered, "Damn freeloaders," under his breath, not caring who heard. One of the teenagers in line stared at Mark with pity, but turned away when Chris glanced their way. Mark exhaled slowly, reminding himself of his mission. He was about to discover how deep this toxic dynamic ran, and if the rumors of employee mistreatment were true, he'd tear the place down from the inside if he had to. "Look, man, if you're so desperate," Chris snarled, pointing toward the dining area, "go wipe down those tables. They're a mess. Maybe I'll see about paying you a couple bucks under the table after closing." The second he said it, Mark felt a spike of anger. A manager was offering to pay an unregistered worker off the books. That was not only illegal, but also a moral red flag, especially for a brand that was supposed to be global and upholding certain standards. Mark nodded weakly, as though resigned to do anything for a bit of cash. This was exactly the kind of evidence he needed to confirm that this store was operating under the radar with shady practices. He shuffled over to the corner where trays piled up, ketchup smears and soggy fries forming a sort of collage on the tables. A rancid smell rose from the trash bins, which were overflowing. The employees behind the counter clearly had no time or inclination to handle the cleaning, likely because Chris was running them ragged with no sense of proper scheduling. While Mark grabbed a dirty rag, Maria stepped up tentatively, glancing over her shoulder to ensure Chris wasn't looking. In a hushed voice, she said, "I'm sorry, he can be a real jerk." She handed Mark a slightly cleaner cloth. "Use this one. Trust me, you'll want to wear gloves for the trash cans." Mark nodded appreciatively, trying to appear meek and grateful. Yet, he studied Maria's face closely. She had dark circles under her eyes, and her posture screamed fatigue. Even so, there was a flicker of kindness there that told Mark she was still holding on to her decency, in spite of the toxic environment. Chris's voice bellowed from behind the counter. "Maria, are you just going to stand there chatting all day? Move your ass!" Maria jumped, nearly dropping the cloth, and Mark could see the way her cheeks burned with humiliation. Without another word, she rushed back to the register to help another customer. Mark clenched his jaw, resisting the urge to blow his cover right there. But if he did that too soon, Chris might bury evidence or twist the story to corporate. He had to wait, gather more intel, let the manager's own actions condemn him. He started wiping down tables, moving from one sticky surface to the next. Every few seconds, he felt Chris's gaze burning into his back, as though ready to pounce on any sign of disobedience. Meanwhile, the father with the two kids had stomped out, cursing under his breath about never returning. Not a single staff member tried to stop him or make things right. It was as if they all knew Chris wouldn't care anyway. A beep from the kitchen signaled that food was ready, but no one went to retrieve it for a good 30 seconds too, tied up with other tasks. That was a small but telling sign. The staff was overworked, disorganized, or both. Mark heard the cook in the back, Jamal, from the name tag glimpsed earlier, call out, "Order up," in a weary voice that had become half automated from routine. No one responded, leaving Jamal to juggle multiple roles at once, preparing fries while also plating a burger that was about to get cold. Suddenly, Chris yelled at Jamal, "Where are the damn nuggets for that order? You slow or something?" Jamal shot him a glare, but bit his tongue. Mark caught that exchange, noticing how the manager chose to hurl demeaning remarks rather than actually solve the staffing crisis. Meanwhile, the line of customers grew. Maria scurried like a mouse, trying to handle both the register and the bagging of food. Mark inched closer to the counter, wanting to catch more of Chris's interactions with employees, when a scrawny teenager, Jake, stepped up to deliver a bag of food to a waiting customer. Chris yanked it back. "No, you're giving them the wrong stuff, idiot," he snapped, rummaging through the bag with a furious scowl. Jake apologized, voice barely above a whisper, and Chris shoved the bag back into his hands. The teenager's face was pale, as if he'd been singled out like this one too many times. Observing the power dynamic made Mark's stomach churn. Chris's approach wasn't just incompetent, it was openly abusive. He wondered how long these employees had endured this, and why no one had spoken up sooner. Likely, fear of losing their jobs was the chain around their necks. A minimum wage employee often couldn't afford to risk that paycheck, meager as it might be. "Hey," Chris called to Mark suddenly, making him flinch on purpose to emphasize the power gap. "When you're done out here, go mop the bathrooms. If you're not done by closing, you don't get paid. Got it?" Mark nodded, lowering his gaze. Inside, his heart pounded with anger. He'd run multiple stores himself. He knew exactly how to treat employees with respect and fairness. This was the polar opposite, a caricature of bad management turned nightmarish. Another customer approached the counter to complain about missing fries. Chris barely looked up, muttering, "You probably ate them already and just want more." "Not my problem," the man bristled, mouth opening in shock. Maria, flustered, tried to intervene, but Chris cut her off. "Don't, Maria. You know we don't owe freebies to every whiner." Mark wiped the same spot on the table repeatedly, just to keep from charging over and telling Chris what he really thought. By now, Mark's phone was vibrating in his pocket. He knew the corporate office was eager for updates. Maybe they wanted a courtesy check-in. He'd told them he'd do this sting operation quietly, so the store owners and managers wouldn't suspect a thing. So far, it was working a bit too well. In less than half an hour, Mark had witnessed open hostility toward customers, employees living in a state of fear, and borderline illegal hiring practices, and he suspected that was only scratching the surface of what was going on behind the scenes. Mark took on the menial tasks Chris demanded, wiping tables, emptying trash, mopping sticky floors, just to keep a low profile. Each chore revealed more signs of neglect, expired cleaning supplies, broken mop handles, greasy buildup around the floor drains. He found himself in the back storage area searching for new trash bags when he overheard hushed voices behind a stack of soda syrup boxes. It was Jake and another employee, probably about the same age, confiding in each other. "I told my mum I'd be able to save up for college," Jake said, voice cracking. "But if I lose this job..." The other employee, a girl with pigtails pinned high, rubbed his shoulder in sympathy. "You won't lose it, Jake. Just keep your head down. Chris is always threatening to fire people, but he hasn't followed through yet." They both sounded terrified, like they believed Chris held ultimate power over them. Mark's jaw clenched at the notion. A real manager should empower young employees, not exploit their desperation. As Mark walked back to the main area, a truck pulled up for a delivery, blocking part of the parking lot. Chris burst out of the doors a moment later, barking at the driver for showing up late, though it was only a few minutes past the scheduled time. Meanwhile, inside, Maria and Jamal exchanged glances. Mark hovered near them, enough to hear Jamal ask, "You get your paycheck sorted yet?" Maria shook her head. "They still owe me for last week's overtime. Chris just told me to talk to payroll, but payroll says they only got the hours he approved." She blinked back tears, voice barely audible. "I'm stuck." Mark bit back a curse. Unapproved overtime, missing wages, all of it was piling on top of the disrespect he'd seen. This was the hidden conflict he'd been sent to uncover. He stepped forward as if looking for a mop bucket, giving Maria and Jamal a subtle nod. "I can help with that," he whispered, voice soft. "I've dealt with stuff like that before." Maria glanced at him with fleeting hope, but fear overshadowed it. She probably saw him as a lost soul trying to find a job himself. Chris stormed back in, nearly shoulder-checking Mark. He aimed a glare at Jamal next. "Hey, stove's on the fritz again. Go deal with it. Or do I gotta do everything around here?" Jamal muttered something under his breath, setting down a spatula and grabbing a beat-up toolbox from under the counter. Mark watched him head into the kitchen's back area, clearly expected to fix equipment far beyond his job description. Mark made a mental note. The grill was malfunctioning, creating a possible safety hazard, and Chris didn't seem concerned about that. A beep signaled fresh fries needing attention, and with Jamal off to fix the stove, no one was tending the fryer. Chris glanced toward Maria. "You want to handle that? Or do I gotta hire some monkeys who know how to multitask?" She rushed over, sweat beading on her forehead, trying to do 3 different tasks at once. Mark could see the tension in her posture. He could almost hear her thoughts. "If I drop the fries, Chris will go ballistic. If I leave the register, I'll get yelled at by a customer." The whole place felt like a pressure cooker, about to blow. Mark had run restaurants under stressful conditions, but never this dysfunctional. People were overworked, terrified, and undervalued. He wondered how this store hadn't been shut down from complaint after complaint. Then again, Chris might be an expert at covering his tracks or scaring employees into silence. Finally, Mark approached Chris. "Sir," he said, injecting a bit of timidity into his voice, "I finished wiping down the tables. Do you, still want me to mop the bathrooms?" Chris shot him a look that practically screamed exasperation. "Yeah, obviously. God, you clueless or something." He shook his head, turning away. "I've got enough idiots around here," he muttered. "You'd fit right in." Mark swallowed the insult and trudged away, not wanting to risk blowing his cover yet. He couldn't wait to see how Chris would react when he learned that Mark was not just some desperate man off the streets, but his boss, far higher up on the corporate ladder than Chris could imagine. However, Mark needed Chris to incriminate himself further, to reveal the extent of the issues. From the short time he'd been here, it was abundantly clear that employees were being mistreated in multiple ways. On his way to the restroom, Mark passed by a bulletin board that should have displayed labor rights information, safety guidelines, and schedules. Instead, it was basically bare, except for a half-torn poster of the McDonald's logo. No labor, law posters, no official bulletins, nothing. Another violation. Mark grit his teeth, pushing open the door to the customer restroom. The smell was nauseating, a mixture of stale urine, chemical cleaner, and something else he couldn't identify. Clearly it hadn't been properly cleaned in a long time. As he started mopping, the mop water quickly turned a swampy brown. Behind him, he heard a mother scolding her child to avoid touching anything in the restroom. It was a small detail, but it underscored the store's total neglect. Mark had seen enough. He decided to keep playing along, gather a bit more evidence, then eventually reveal himself. He had no idea how far Chris's abuses went, but based on the staff's reactions, it was likely they went too far. Mark re-emerged from the bathroom, rolling the mop bucket away, his nerves frayed from what he'd seen. Chris stood near the registers, arms folded, scanning the dining area like a hawk. Customers had diminished to a trickle, probably deterred by the negative experiences they'd heard from others. The franchise was losing business because of this incompetent tyrant, but Mark suspected Chris might be padding the books or cutting corners. After all, the labor costs were probably low if he was shortchanging staff and pushing them to work off the clock. That thought hardened Mark's resolve. It was time to dig deeper. He glanced around, noting that one of the employees, Jamal, was missing from the cook station. Chris shouted into the back, "Hey Jamal, get your ass out here!" In response, Jamal trudged out, grease stains on his uniform, holding a burnt piece of something that might have been a burger patty. He muttered, "The grill's not holding. Temperature. Food's getting ruined." Chris just snorted. "Well, fix it faster, or I'll find somebody who can." Jamal mumbled, "We could call an actual repair guy." Chris's eyes narrowed. "Yeah, and waste money that comes out of my bonus. No thanks. Do it yourself." That's when Mark fully realized that Chris had some incentive scheme that made him cut corners at every turn. Possibly the store's owner, or the manager above Chris, if there was one, was either oblivious or complicit. Just as Mark thought it couldn't get worse, a new argument broke out at the counter. A customer who had been waiting too long for their order walked up demanding a refund. Chris flatly refused. "We already started making your food," he said, pointing to a half-wrapped burger. "No refunds." The customer's face flushed in anger. "But it's been 20 minutes, and I gotta get back to work. I can't wait any longer." Chris threw his arms up. "Not my problem. Order's almost done. Wait or leave." The customer slammed a hand on the counter, clearly furious. "You know what? Keep your damn food." He stomped out, leaving his bag half-packed. On the counter, Maria glanced at Chris with a mixture of fear and disgust. She opened her mouth, perhaps to suggest they bag the order for someone else, or offer something to smooth things over, but Chris caught her eye and she clammed up. Mark was certain that behind Chris's foul attitude lay an even darker truth. The manager was either skimming money, committing wage theft, or at least perpetuating a culture of borderline abuse. Suddenly, another commotion came from the back of the kitchen. The fryer beeped loudly, indicating it had overheated. Jamal, cursing under his breath, tried to shut it off, but the beep continued like an alarm. Chris stormed in, face red. "What the hell are you doing?" Jamal gritted his teeth. "I told you it needed fixing. The oil's too hot. We could start a fire." Chris grabbed Jamal's wrist, yanking him away from the fryer. "Then shut the damn thing off. Don't just stand there like a moron." A few customers watched, eyes wide, as the confrontation spilled out into the open. Maria flinched, stepping closer as if ready to intervene. Mark tensed. He'd witnessed enough subtle red flags, but now these incidents were piling up in front of customers, risking safety hazards. Chris seemed either unaware or unconcerned that he was physically rough with Jamal, or that a potentially dangerous machine was malfunctioning. A manager truly concerned for the operation wouldn't yank employees around. He'd ensure the equipment was safe. This was the meltdown Mark had dreaded seeing, but also needed as evidence. He took a steadying breath. He wasn't ready to reveal himself yet, but the situation was nearing a breaking point. If an actual fire started, customers and employees could be at risk. Mark hovered near the door to the kitchen, prepared to step in if things turned dangerous. Chris was barking orders. Jamal was frantically punching buttons on the fryer, and Maria was scrambling to keep the front of house running. Mark noticed the tension among the employees. Half of them seemed to be silently praying not to get singled out next, while the other half looked ready to walk out. Yet no one actually did. which spoke volumes about how desperately they all needed these paychecks. The sad truth of fast food employment was that too many people relied on any income they could get. Chris was exploiting that desperation like some sort of tyrant. In the corner of the dining area, an older man in tattered clothes shuffled in, seemingly homeless himself. He stood near the soda fountain, hoping for a free cup of water. When Chris spotted him, he pointed and barked, "No loitering! Get out!" Or, "I'm calling the cops." The older man looked startled, and Maria glanced apologetically at him, but said nothing. Mark's heart clenched at the irony. He was disguised as homeless, but he was actually a boss who could transform the entire store with a snap of his fingers. That old man was the real deal, and Chris was humiliating him. Chris took a threatening step forward, as if he might physically force the older man out. Mark set the mop bucket aside and edged forward. Enough was enough. Before he could say anything, however, the beep of the fryer reached an ear-splitting pitch, and a loud hiss of steam burst from the back. For a tense second, everyone in the dining area froze, fixated on whether an explosion or fire was about to erupt. Jamal managed to switch it off, and the beep died. The crisis abated, at least temporarily, but the hush in the room felt ominous. A minute later, the hush broke as the old homeless man hurried out, practically chased by Chris's glare. Maria exhaled shakily, wiping her brow. The tension in the air was so thick it could be sliced with a spatula. Mark realized that the store's meltdown was accelerating, and if Chris didn't calm down, something bigger was bound to happen. A major blow-up that could involve the police, or at least a corporate meltdown. As if on cue, Chris grabbed a stack of papers from behind the counter, a schedule, half rumpled and covered in notes. He waved it at Maria, voice dripping with sarcasm. "I got the new schedule. Guess who's working nights all week? Congrats." "You are?" Maria paled. "But I have classes." Chris cut her off. "Do I look like I care? I need someone who can close. And guess what? You don't have kids, so you're it." She opened her mouth to protest, but he slammed the papers onto the counter. "You don't like it? You can walk. There's the door." Something snapped in Maria. She'd been swallowing Chris's abuse for far too long. Her eyes flicked to Mark, then back to Chris. With a tremor in her voice, she said, "This isn't right. You can't just..." She hesitated, then found some backbone. "I'm not staying late every single night. I have a right to a reasonable schedule." The small crowd of employees behind her seemed to collectively hold their breath. Jamal, especially, watched with wide eyes. Chris laughed, a harsh, joyless bark. "Oh right, you're an hourly worker. You do what I say. You don't like it, you can kiss this job goodbye. That's how it works." His voice rose, echoing around the half-empty restaurant, ensuring customers could hear him. "Corporate doesn't give a damn. They just want numbers. You think you're better than me? You think you can run this store?" His chest puffed with arrogance. Maria's cheeks flushed, and tears threatened to spill, but she squared her shoulders, turning her palms up. "We deserve better than you," she managed softly, shaking with either fear or anger. The declaration made Chris's face turn an alarming shade of red, and he smacked a hand on the counter so hard the registers rattled. "What did you say?" he hissed. Maria glanced at Jamal for support, but he just looked at the floor, not daring to raise his head. Jake, the teenager who'd been chewed out earlier, took a small step forward and then immediately stepped back, evidently torn between solidarity and self-preservation. The customers who were still in the dining area watched with wide eyes, some pulling out their phones to record the brewing confrontation. Chris's eyes darted around, realizing he was now the main attraction in a public spectacle. His pride stung. He pointed at Maria. "Go take out the trash if you're so fired up, now." She swallowed but didn't move. Mark could see she was considering standing her ground, possibly quitting on the spot, but fear for her future must have held her in check. Finally, with a trembling exhale, she walked around the counter to the trash bins, tears threatening to spill. It was a small, painful moment of defeat. Chris smirked, turning to the other employees. "Anyone else want to try me today? Huh?" Silence. Mark ground his teeth, the urge to intervene growing too strong to ignore. But if he blew his cover, would it truly help these employees in the long run? Or should he wait for a more definitive moment, one that would expose the entire rotten structure? Meanwhile, the beep of the fryer was replaced by the droning of fluorescent lights overhead. The oppressive hush settled back in. Chris busied himself by shoving schedule papers into a binder, occasionally casting glances at Maria as if expecting further rebellion. When none came, he barked at Jake to restock the napkins, then hollered at Jamal to fix a squeaky hinge on the freezer door. A loud crash echoed from the back of the dining area. Maria had tripped while dragging a heavy trash bag, scattering refuse across the floor. Instantly, Chris marched over, looking ready to unleash another tirade. Mark tensed, prepared to step in if Chris tried to lay a hand on her. Maria was on her knees, gathering up spilled wrappers, her face burning with humiliation. But before Chris could say anything, a worried customer placed a hand on Maria's shoulder, helping her up. "Just let her pick it up," Mark heard himself say, voice firm but still disguised as the quiet man he'd been playing. "It's not her fault the bag was too heavy." Chris rounded on him, eyes narrowed. "Who the hell do you think you are? You're not an employee here. I just told you to do a couple odd jobs. You want a confrontation?" Mark held up his hands in a placating gesture. "No, I don't. But you shouldn't." Chris cut him off. "Then shut your mouth." The tension was so thick, it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Mark looked around at the cluster of employees, each one caught between wanting to defend Maria and not wanting to incur Chris's wrath. The manager turned to Maria one last time. "Clean it up, and maybe I'll let you clock out in an hour if we're not too busy." She nodded stiffly, returning to her knees to gather trash. Mark quietly moved to help her, ignoring Chris's scowl. Maria muttered a quiet, "Thank you," under her breath. As they worked, Mark stole a glance at the manager. Chris was rummaging through the binder, probably looking for more ways to cut hours or reassign shifts. The employees wore the hollow expressions of people who had endured too many indignities to count. Something was about to break. Mark could feel it in the stale air, in the trembling frustration evident on Maria's face, in the resentment building in Jamal's stance. The meltdown was imminent, and when it finally happened, Mark intended to make sure Chris faced the consequences in front of everyone. The moment of public humiliation arrived faster than Mark anticipated. The next wave of customers came in, a small rush, possibly a local youth sports team and their parents. Immediately, the counter turned chaotic. Maria, still frazzled from her confrontation with Chris, struggled to handle the sudden influx of orders. Jamal dashed to the back to keep up with the cooking demands, while Jake scrambled between drive-through and front register tasks, obviously short on experience or training. Chris, instead of helping, loomed over them, hollering instructions that contradicted each other. "Maria, get that order out. Jake, watch the drive-through. Jamal, speed it up." Meanwhile, half of the customers' food started piling up, orders getting mixed, confusion intensifying by the minute. The group of parents, wanting to feed a dozen hungry kids, grew impatient. One father, face tight with annoyance, approached the counter. "Hey, we've been waiting 15 minutes. My kids are getting cranky and we've got to get home soon." Chris responded with a theatrical sigh. "What do you want me to do about it? We're short-handed." He jerked a thumb at Maria, who was frantically bagging fries. "She can't keep up with a rush." Maria's cheeks burned and she moved, even faster, nearly dropping a carton of fries in her haste. The father's jaw clenched. "Maybe if you gave her some help instead of barking orders, we'd all get out of here quicker." Chris scoffed. "You think you can run this store better than me? You're just another impatient customer who thinks the world revolves around you." The father blinked, taken aback. "What the hell is your problem, man?" Things escalated rapidly from there. Another parent chimed in. "We just want our kids' meals. You don't have to be an ass about it." Chris whipped his head around, eyes flaring. "Watch who you're calling an ass. This is my store. I'm the one in charge here." By now, several of the kids were watching nervously, picking up on the adult tension. Maria glanced at Jamal, who nodded at her, a silent acknowledgement that they'd both had enough. She stepped forward, voice shaking, but loud enough for the parents to hear. "I'm sorry, everyone. We're trying our best. Please bear with us while we get your orders out." Chris let out a derisive laugh. "Yeah, apologize all you want. Doesn't change the fact that some people don't know how to be patient." That was the final straw for one of the mothers. She marched right up to the counter. "Is there another manager we can talk to? Because you obviously don't give a damn about customers." Chris planted his hands on the counter, leaning forward menacingly. "You think corporate's gonna listen to you over me? I know how this game works, lady. We've been short-staffed for months, and corporate doesn't do shit about it. So why should I?" The parents started to argue among themselves, some pulling out their phones to record. Chris grabbed a tray and slammed it on the counter, shouting, "If you want your money back, you're not getting it. Orders are almost done. Take it or leave." A hush fell, heavy and heated, as the crowd seethed with indignation. At that exact moment, Maria handed over a couple of completed orders, trying to mollify the situation. Jamal frantically bagged more items in the back, sweat pouring down his temples. The tension built like a storm cloud about to unleash. Mark stood off to the side, arms folded, heart pounding. He realized that if he waited any longer, there might be a riot in the lobby. He stepped toward the center of the chaos, raising his voice. "Listen, everyone, just calm down for a moment." Chris glared. "You again? I thought I told you to mop the bathrooms, not play mediator." Mark took a breath. "I think these customers have a right to complain about the way they're being treated." He glanced meaningfully at the row of disgruntled parents, the kids behind them. "And these employees have a right to better leadership." Chris barked a laugh, gesturing wildly at the employees. "Leadership? These losers can barely tie their own shoes. I'm the only reason this place hasn't burned down." Some of the employees physically recoiled at his words. Jamal took a step forward, fists clenched, but Maria grabbed his arm, shaking her head urgently. A father from the youth team snapped, "That's enough! You don't talk to your staff like that. I'm calling corporate myself." He took out his phone, presumably searching for a customer service number. Chris threw up his hands. "Call whoever you want. I doubt they'll even bother to write your complaint down." Suddenly, Mark noticed that one of the parents was already filming, capturing Chris's tirade in high definition. The manager seemed oblivious to how the footage would look to the outside world, or maybe he just didn't care. Mark's pulse hammered in his veins. This could blow up in the store's face, or it could be the perfect catalyst for him to step in officially. A hush fell as Chris turned his scorn back to Maria. "And you," he growled, flicking her name tag with a finger. "Don't think I won't remember how you talked back earlier. You might find yourself with no hours next week if you keep testing me." Maria swallowed hard, panic evident in her eyes. Mark couldn't stand it anymore. With a resolve that sent adrenaline surging through his body, he stepped forward. This was the moment. "That's not going to happen," he said clearly, his voice carrying through the hushed dining area. Chris turned, startled by Mark's sudden confidence. "Who do you think you are, telling me how to run my store?" Mark reached up and slowly pulled back his hood. "I'm not who you think I am," he said, letting his words hang. Across the restaurant, phones were poised to record every second. Chris snorted, crossing his arms. "Oh, let me guess. You're a reporter or something. You gonna write a sob story about how mean old Chris is?" Mark locked eyes with him, calm and purposeful. "Not exactly." He reached into his pocket, extracted a small ID badge that bore the McDonald's corporate logo, then flicked it open for Chris to see. "Mark Redford, Regional Manager." Silence crashed over the room like thunder. Chris's eyes bugged, and several customers gaped openly. The employees, Jamal, Maria, Jake, looked stunned, but also relieved, as if they finally saw a lifeline they'd never expected. Mark took a single step forward, feeling the full weight of his corporate authority. "I'm here to conduct a surprise inspection. More specifically, I'm undercover." Chris tried to hide his shock, but his face betrayed him. "You've got to be shitting me," he whispered, color draining from his cheeks. Mark didn't bother mincing words. "I've seen more labor violations and abusive behavior in the last couple hours than I've seen in my entire career. This ends now." A ripple of excitement ran through the employees, while Chris sputtered, You can't just walk in here playing dress-up." Mark ignored his protests, addressing the customers first. "Thank you for your patience. Anyone who has an issue with their order will be fully refunded today. I apologize on behalf of this establishment." The father from earlier, phone still in hand, nodded slowly. "Appreciate it, man." Chris tried to regain control, voice shaking. "Hold on, you're not corporate. You're some big-shot manager, sure, but you don't own this place." Mark cut him off. "Actually, I do. By virtue of my position, I have authority over every franchise in this region. And from the looks of things, you've been operating in a manner that defies every standard we have." He turned to the employees. "Maria, Jamal, Jake, if you could please gather near the counter." They stepped forward, trembling with a mix of nerves and hope. Chris snapped, "Stay where you are," but no one listened to him anymore. Mark raised a hand to calm them, then spoke clearly. "Can one of you please confirm that the issues I've observed, lack of breaks, withheld overtime pay, verbal abuse, have been ongoing for a while?" Maria bit her lip, then nodded, tears welling up. "Yes, it's all true," Jamal added. He's been shorting our checks, telling us we can't clock in until we have a line at the door." Jake chimed in. "He threatens to fire us if we don't stay late." Chris's face turned ashen, but he tried one last tactic. "Don't believe them. They're lazy. They don't do their jobs." Mark pointed at the crowd of parents. "You seriously want to claim these customers are lying too? Everyone here has witnessed your conduct." A mother in the group waved her phone. "It's all on video," she said. "We've got you on camera, buddy." The tension in the room morphed into a charged anticipation, like a collective inhale before the final hammer drops. Chris locked his jaw, veins standing out on his neck. "You can't do anything to me without the store owner's approval," he said through clenched teeth. Mark gave a short, humorless laugh. "Did you not hear me? I am the store owner in the sense that I have the direct power to revoke this franchise agreement if it comes to that. But first, let's address you." He straightened his stance, commanding every eye in the room. Chris's breath came in heavy, loud puffs. "I've got contacts. You can't just waltz in here and talk to me like this." Mark's gaze was unwavering. "You've done enough damage. You've undermined the reputation of this brand and mistreated employees, not to mention customers. Consider this your official termination." He took a breath, letting the words reverberate. "Chris, you're fired. Effective immediately." For a split second, it seemed Chris wouldn't accept it, that he might lash out physically. His eyes darted from Mark to the employees, to the parents filming him, and back again. A flicker of panic crossed his features. Then everything boiled over at once. "This is bullshit!" he yelled, slamming a fist on the counter. "I kept this place running while corporate turned a blind eye to everything." He gestured at the employees. "You think these losers know how to handle a store without me?" The outburst only sealed his fate in the eyes of everyone present. Mark maintained a steely calm. "Step away from the counter, Chris. Your authority here is over." So, some of the customers, braver now, started muttering agreements. A father from the sports team gave a cheer, clapping a couple of times, prompting a few others to join in. Chris spun around, nearly knocking over a display of Happy Meal boxes, rage painting his face red. He glared at Jamal. "Fine, see how you do without me. Let's see how many of you get to keep your jobs when the next rush hits, and you can't handle it." Jamal glared back, but his face held a mixture of relief and residual anger. Seeing no support, Chris made a last-ditch attempt to intimidate Mark. "I'll be speaking to my lawyer. You can't do this." But Mark's firm voice cut through. "I can, and I will. Now leave before I have security escort you out." Chris opened his mouth to swear again, but a few of the larger parents positioned themselves in a way that made it clear they'd help Mark if needed. The manager huffed, grabbed a set of keys from his pocket, and tossed them on the counter. "Screw this place," he growled. Then, with a final muttered, "Bullshit," Chris shoved past the throng of onlookers and headed for the door. He paused only to spit on the sidewalk outside before stomping off into the parking lot. A hush lingered, everyone processing what had just transpired. Then, all at once, relief washed over the employees' faces, a palpable sense that the storm had finally passed. Moments later, a wave of clapping and exhale. Tension swept through the restaurant. Mark turned to the parents and the lingering customers. "I appreciate everyone's patience and apologize on behalf of McDonald's for what you witnessed." He gestured toward Maria and Jamal. "We'll fix your orders and give you full refunds. That's a promise." The parents, mollified, nodded their thanks. Some stayed to get their corrected meals, while others took their refunds and left, relief evident in their smiles. The energy in the restaurant had flipped from despair to cautious hope in a matter of minutes. With Chris gone, Maria set down the tray of fries she'd been holding and let out a shaky breath. Jamal slumped against the counter, eyes closed for a moment. Jake rubbed his arms, looking around like he could hardly believe it was over. The store was quieter now, a hush that rang with possibility rather than intimidation. Mark turned to the employees. "First order of business. Everyone, take a deep breath. You're not in trouble. I know you've been through a lot." Maria's lower lip quivered. She whispered, "Is it really done? He's not coming back, right?" Mark shook his head gently. "He's gone. And if he tries to come back, he'll be trespassing." Jamal let out a bitter laugh that turned into a sigh of relief. "Man, I thought I'd be stuck under that asshole forever." Jake shuffled forward. "Does this mean we keep our jobs?" Mark offered him a reassuring smile. "Absolutely. If you still want them, that is. There are going to be changes. Immediate changes." The teenager looked like he might cry from sheer relief. "Thank you, sir." Mark moved around the counter, beckoning the employees to follow. He addressed them quietly, but firmly, away from the remaining customers. "I'll need statements from each of you about what happened here. The wage theft, the intimidation, the withheld overtime. Corporate will conduct a proper investigation, and will make sure you get every cent owed." He glanced at Maria. "You have classes?" She nodded, wiping her eyes. "Yes, I'm studying nursing." "Chris, he wouldn't let me schedule." "Around my final exams." Mark nodded. "From now on, we'll accommodate your schedule. That's non-negotiable." Her face lit up with gratitude. Jamal added, I'm a father of two. I've been needing a raise. But Chris, his voice trailed off. Mark placed a hand on his shoulder. That's on the table as well. But let's do this right. I'll be here for a few days to sort out the books, fix scheduling, and help you get this place running smoothly. We'll bring in extra support staff if needed, and we'll get a repair technician for the grill. Jamal barked a relieved laugh. That is the best news I've heard in ages. They all shared a moment of mutual relief. No one fully relaxed yet, as the adrenaline of the confrontation was still coursing through their veins, but hope was blossoming in the cracks left by Chris's tyranny. Before they could revel in their newfound freedom, a couple of curious customers approached. Mark quickly addressed them, fielding concerns, issuing apologies, offering refunds or replacement meals. It was a hectic process, but one that felt wholly different without Chris's looming presence. Even Maria's posture changed. She greeted people with genuine warmth, though her eyes were still rimmed with the aftermath of tears. In the midst of the chaos, Mark paused to watch the employees in action. Without Chris barking orders, they formed a natural teamwork. Maria stepped in to handle the register. Jake worked diligently on bagging orders, and Jamal managed the kitchen. It wasn't perfect, but it was miles better than the toxic environment from an hour ago. Mark nodded to himself. This store could thrive under the right leadership. The crowd thinned, leaving a calmer dining area. Mark spotted the schedule binder Chris had slammed around. He picked it up, flipping through the scribbled notes, evidence of shift manipulations, odd scribbles that might indicate pay cut corners. He grimaced, realizing how extensive the damage was, but that was a problem for tomorrow. Right now, the staff needed to be reassured they were safe, that they could finally work without fear of retribution. With the rush over, Mark encouraged the employees to take a short break. Maria sipped a cup of water, leaning against the counter as she caught her breath. Jamal wiped sweat from his brow and looked around the store like he was seeing it for the first time. Jake stepped outside for some fresh air. Mark understood. They needed a mental reset, even if it was just for a few minutes. While the staff regrouped, Mark found a moment to converse with a few remaining customers, offering personal apologies. One couple, quietly finishing their fries, gave Mark a grateful nod. We've come here a few times and the service was always rough, the woman admitted. Thank you for stepping in. Mark smiled politely. I'm sorry you had to go through that. We'll make sure it's different from now on. By the time he returned to the employees, Maria had regained her composure. She looked at Mark with earnest eyes. Mark, do you really think we can turn this place around? Chris always said corporate didn't care about smaller franchises. Mark gave a confident nod. Trust me, corporate cares. They just need to know what's happening. Sometimes problems slip through the cracks, especially if a manager is hiding them. But once we see it, we act. That's what brought me here. Jamal folded his arms. He told us he was unstoppable, that we'd get fired if we ever spoke up. Some of us tried calling the corporate hotline, but nothing changed. Mark's jaw tightened. I'm going to look into that too. It's possible your complaints got filtered out before reaching the right people. That won't happen again. I'll make sure of it. Jake poked his head back inside, breathing heavily like he'd just needed to release tension. He joined the circle. So, what now? Mark looked at the group, realizing they craved reassurance and direction. First, I'll cover the front with whoever's comfortable so we can serve any straggling customers. Then, we close up properly tonight. No forced overtime, no corner cutting. Tomorrow morning, I'll bring in a specialist to inspect the equipment and handle any urgent repairs. We'll also have a meeting about scheduling, wages, and your rights as employees. He saw a sense of relief mixed with cautious optimism in their eyes. For them, this was a complete reversal of fortune. Maria managed a weak laugh. That sounds amazing, actually. Jamal nodded vigorously. Feels like a dream. Mark empathized. He'd seen too many employees treated like cogs in a machine, but this was the worst case he'd encountered in recent memory. He hated that it had taken so long for him to personally intervene, but at least now it was happening. We still have to deal with the formalities, he said, like filing an official complaint and launching an investigation into wage theft. But you have my word, we'll fix this. Just as he spoke, an older homeless man tentatively entered, the same one Chris had chased off earlier. He lingered by the door, eyes flicking around anxiously. Maria immediately walked over, offering a gentle smile. Mark watched as she poured a small cup of water and handed it to him. It was a simple act of kindness, one that stood in stark contrast to Chris's cruelty. The man nodded in gratitude and sat in a corner booth, nursing the water like it was gold. That moment underlined the shift in atmosphere. Compassion had replaced hostility. Mark's chest tightened with a sense of purpose. This was exactly the environment a community fast food restaurant should foster. He stepped over to the homeless man, speaking softly. "Sir, if you need something to eat, let me know." The man glanced at him, wary at first, then nodded. Mark looked toward the employees. "Let's get him a meal. On the house." No one protested. In fact, Jamal stepped forward. "I'll whip something up fast." Maria quickly grabbed a tray while Jake poured a soda. The man stammered a quiet thank you, and Mark felt a rush of satisfaction at seeing the team come together under a new paradigm of empathy and respect. The night wore on quietly. Customers came and went, unaware of the dramatic showdown that had occurred earlier. Mark hopped behind the counter, helping fill orders and even flipping a few burgers alongside Jamal, who was thrilled to have the grill working at partial capacity after some tinkering. It wasn't perfect, but it felt like progress. In between tasks, Mark took mental notes of what needed immediate attention. The fryer needed professional servicing, the schedule had to be rebuilt from scratch, and the employees' pay needed an audit to ensure everyone got what they were owed. He intended to stay up late that night, poring over the numbers in the back office. The meltdown Chris had orchestrated was almost a gift in disguise. It revealed every rotten corner of the operation, giving Mark the ammunition he needed to institute real, lasting change. As closing time approached, the employees steeled themselves for what was usually the worst part of the day. Under Chris's regime, they would have been forced to stay late without proper pay. Now, with Mark in charge, they tackled the cleanup. Together in half the usual time, each person assigned manageable tasks that matched their strengths. There was no yelling, no intimidation, just a collaborative effort that left the store cleaner than Mark had seen it all day. When they finally turned off the open sign, the last customers had trickled out, leaving behind an unusual calm. Maria slid into a booth, dropping her tired body onto the seat. "That's it then?" she asked, eyes reflecting a cautious hope. Mark nodded, setting aside a stack of receipts. "That's it for today. Everyone clocks out now, accurately, and goes home. I'll review timesheets tonight to ensure no one's shorted any pay." Jake hovered, looking unsure. "Sir, I usually have to help restock for tomorrow. That's what Chris always said." No restock, no paycheck. Mark's face darkened at the memory of Chris's manipulation. "We'll cover restocking as a scheduled task tomorrow morning. Tonight, just go home. You've earned it." The teenager's eyes lit up as if Mark had handed him a winning lottery ticket. "Thanks," he whispered, scurrying off to get his bag. Maria let out a shaky laugh, leaning against the booth's back. "It feels unreal, but a good unreal." Jamal, finishing up in the kitchen, asked if Mark needed him to stay for a quick inspection. "Thanks for offering," Mark said, "but I want you to get home to your kids. We'll do a thorough inspection in the morning." Jamal nodded, grateful. "Man, I can't believe it. This is the first time in months I'll be out of here before midnight." The employees gathered their things, exchanging relieved smiles. A few offered Mark heartfelt thank yous. Maria's voice caught in her throat as she said, I'm sorry we didn't do something sooner. We all needed the money." Mark patted her shoulder gently. "I understand." Chris exploited. "Your fear. That's on him, not you." She blinked back tears, nodded, and left with the others, giving Mark a final wave at the door. Alone in the quiet lobby, Mark flipped through the store's ledger, scanning for discrepancies. The neon lights outside cast a faint glow on the empty table. He thought back to Chris's meltdown, the moment he'd fired him in front of everyone. It had been dramatic, borderline chaotic, but it was exactly what this store needed. A public, decisive stand against injustice. A soft knock on the glass startled him. It was the homeless man, giving a half wave. Mark opened the door slightly. "Did you need something else?" he asked gently. The man shook his head. "Just wanted to say thanks for the meal." He hesitated, then mumbled, "I used to work in a place like this. Before things went bad." Mark frowned sympathetically. "If you're ever looking for work again, we might have an opening, but let's see how tomorrow goes, okay?" The man offered a tight, grateful smile. "Okay." Then he turned and shuffled away into the night. Mark locked the doors behind him, exhaling a pent-up breath. So much had happened in one day. He'd come here expecting to find minor problems, but what he discovered was a full-blown crisis that demanded immediate, forceful action. And he'd delivered. Chris was gone, the staff was freed, and the customers who had witnessed the confrontation left with renewed faith in corporate accountability. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, a thorough investigation, potential legal ramifications for Chris, possibly retraining staff who had been browbeaten into submission for so long. But Mark felt a sense of accomplishment he rarely experienced in the bureaucratic side of corporate life. He had directly intervened, personally put an end to an abusive manager, and potentially change the course of these employees' lives. Glancing at the darkened dining area, Mark pictured what it could be a month from now, a bustling, welcoming environment, staffed by people who felt valued, where customers weren't snapped at or ignored. He imagined a place where employees like Maria could juggle work and school, where Jamal could earn a living wage without suffering constant harassment, and where Jake could learn the ropes without intimidation. He turned off the lights, one by one, until only the emergency lights remained. Stepping outside, he locked the door, hearing the click echo in the empty parking lot. The air was crisp, a slight breeze ruffling his hair. For the first time that day, his shoulders relaxed. Maybe this was the beginning of a better chapter for everyone. Meowts. Several days passed, and the official corporate review team descended upon the store with Mark leading the charge. They combed through wage reports, daily sales, scheduling records, uncovering all the shady manipulations Chris had inflicted on his staff. As expected, numerous labor violations came to light, from denying legally mandated breaks to altering clock-in times. Chris, they learned, had been skimming labor hours off the books to make the store's performance look better, which in turn padded his bonuses. Corporate swiftly initiated legal proceedings, making it clear Chris would never manage another McDonald's again. During that stretch, Mark worked side by side with the employees, training them on the correct protocols, ensuring safety standards, and establishing a new hierarchy. He even put in a call to the local workforce agency, seeking to hire more staff so the existing team wouldn't be stretched to their limits. Maria was astonished when Mark presented her with a revised schedule that actually worked around her college classes. She even got a slight promotion to shift lead, recognizing her reliability. Jamal received a bump in pay and official recognition for stepping up as the primary cook. Jake got more structured training, which he embraced eagerly. On the final day of the investigation, Mark organized a small meeting in the dining area after closing. The staff assembled around a few tables pulled together, each looking a mix of tired and hopeful. Some sat in uniform, others with jackets on, ready to head home. Mark stood at the head of the table, scanning the group, Maria fiddling with her phone, Jamal tapping a foot anxiously, Jake holding a notepad. A few new hires from the workforce agency were present too, curious about their new environment. "I want to thank all of you," Mark began, voice warm but authoritative. "I know it's been a whirlwind. We've had corporate investigators here. We've reviewed documents and schedules. We've made adjustments. And through it all, you've kept this store running, serving customers. You should be proud of yourselves." Maria blushed. Jamal flashed a grin, and Jake sat up straighter. Mark continued. "Chris was fired for cause. He won't be returning. Legally, he's barred from managing within this company again. I know some of you might still worry about retaliation, but I want to assure you that corporate is standing behind these decisions 100%. If he tries to contact you or intimidate you in any way, let me know immediately. We will take action." A wave of relief passed over the group. Then Mark smiled softly. "All the unpaid wages and overtime are being calculated. You'll receive what you're owed in your next checks, retroactively. It might take a little longer for everything to process, but it's happening. Any further discrepancies, you come to me directly. No more smoke and mirrors." The employees looked at one another, awe washing over their faces. Some had never dreamed they'd actually see those stolen wages again. Before Mark could say more, Jamal piped up. "You know, we all used to dread coming to work. Now it feels like maybe this place can be something positive." A few heads nodded in agreement, and Maria added, "I used to feel sick in the mornings, just thinking about Chris yelling at me. Now I can breathe." Her voice trembled slightly, betraying how deeply Chris's abuse had cut. Mark took a moment to let their words sink in. "That's what I wanted to hear. This store has potential, not just to meet corporate standards, but to be a supportive workplace that values each of you. It's not going to be perfect overnight. We have a lot of rebuilding to do, from equipment repairs to staff scheduling. But if we work together, we can make this into a model franchise." He glanced around at the new hires, who listened with rapt attention. "As for you new folks, welcome aboard. You've joined at a time of great change. We'll make sure you get properly trained with fair hours and a safe environment." One of them, a woman named Nina, gave a small nod and a smile. She'd been hired out of necessity when the store realized just how understaffed they truly were. Mark cleared his throat. "Now, I don't want to keep you too long. You've all got lives outside of this place. But if anyone has questions or concerns, speak freely. This isn't Chris's reign anymore. No one here will punish you for being honest." Jake shifted nervously. "What if we have to stay late sometimes? Like if there's a big rush or the next shift is late?" Mark nodded. "Sometimes. Overtime is unavoidable in restaurants. but you'll be paid for every minute you work, and we'll do our best to manage the schedule to avoid unnecessary overtime. Jake exhaled, tension leaving his shoulders. A brief silence fell. Maria then spoke up, voice still tinged with shyness. I just want to say thank you for not looking the other way. A lot of managers come through, say they'll help, but it never changes. Mark met her gaze. I was undercover because corporate heard rumors. We tried trusting the usual channels, but Chris must have been very good at hiding the truth. I'm sorry it took this long. Maria shook her head. You're here now. That's what matters. They wrapped up the meeting with a round of applause that felt almost surreal. Mark could hardly believe the transformation in morale from just a few days ago. After dismissing them, he lingered, turning off lights and closing up the store with a sense of satisfaction. A wave of employees walked out together, chattering quietly, some even laughing. The door clicked behind them, and Mark felt a calm hush envelop the space. He locked up for the night, stepping into the cool air. In the distance, he saw the silhouette of the homeless man from before, rummaging through a nearby trash bin. Mark jogged over, heart pounding with empathy. Hey, he called softly, not wanting to startle him. The man turned, face reflecting the harsh realities of life on the streets. What is it? He asked warily. Mark reached into his pocket, pulling out a small business card. I meant what I said the other day. If you're looking for work, come by tomorrow. We'll figure something out, or at least help you get some resources. The man studied the card, tears glistening faintly in his eyes. You serious? Mark nodded, dead serious. The man tucked the card into his threadbare coat. Thank you, he whispered. Mark gave a short nod, then headed back to his car, the parking lot illuminated by a single flickering street lamp. He slid into the driver's seat, exhaustion settling into his bones, but it was the good kind, hard-earned and purposeful. Driving away from the restaurant, Mark replayed the events in his mind, stepping in as a disguised homeless man, facing Chris's venomous behavior, unveiling his identity in front of a stunned crowd, firing the abusive manager on the spot. The entire ordeal had been a whirlwind of tension and triumph, culminating in a shift that would hopefully stick for good. He recalled the moment Chris realized Mark's true status, the shock, the desperate attempts to salvage control, the public meltdown. It was a scene Mark wouldn't forget anytime soon. He'd seen all manner of managerial missteps in his tenure, but rarely such blatant cruelty and exploitation. This story would serve as a cautionary tale in corporate circles, a grim reminder that power in the wrong hands can lead to a toxic environment, and that employees' voices need to be heard before situations escalate to this point. But the story wouldn't end with Chris's firing. That was just the climax. The real resolution lay in how Mark and the employees built a new culture. In the days to come, Mark would oversee the store's operations, ensuring wages were paid correctly, shift schedules were fair, and equipment was properly maintained. He'd likely make unannounced visits in the future, just to keep everyone on their toes. But from what he saw in Maria's perseverance, Jamal's dedication, and Jake's eagerness, he believed they could thrive if given proper support. As he drove through dimly lit streets toward his hotel, he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. He'd fought for justice in a place where it was sorely lacking, and he'd inspired a team to believe in a better way of doing things. That was the essence of leadership. Real leadership, not the bullying facade Chris had practiced. A small sign by the roadside indicated another fast food chain. Ironically, Mark thought about pulling over for a late snack, but decided against it. He'd had enough greasy air for one day. Tomorrow, he'd return to the store bright and early with a coffee in hand, ready to set up a safer fryer system and finalize the payroll corrections. He pulled into the hotel parking lot, cut the engine, and leaned back in the seat, exhaling slowly. Maybe one day, these employees would tell stories about how a homeless man showed up one night and turned their toxic workplace upside down, leaving it better than before. That thought drew a tired but genuine smile to Mark's face. Stepping out of the car, he felt the night air against his skin, crisp and almost cleansing. He glanced up at the stars scattered across the sky, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Tomorrow would be the start of a new chapter for that store, and for him as a manager who'd never hesitate to stand up for what was right. With that comforting realization, he walked inside the hotel, letting the door close softly behind him, ready for whatever challenges lay ahead.